Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Suburban Rifleman. I'm Greg. It's June 7th. I got some really good news just a couple of days ago. We have now moved into a yellow zone. That means that all of the gun clubs and shooting ranges are open for business once again. That's great news because it means that there will be some shooting segments coming up on the channel in the not too distant future. I'm going to give it a couple of weeks for the crowds to die down. I'm sure there are people that are kind of higher priority than I am, competitive shooters, maybe some folks with hunting trips coming up. I'm going to let them do their shooting, but I promise we are going to get out to the range and do some actual shooting, probably with some of the guns we're going to be taking a look at in the next couple videos. But I've come across a couple of rifles and maybe a couple of handguns as I've been going through my inventory that I think are worth taking a closer look at, and I want to do a couple of benchtop videos. And that's what today's segment is going to be. And the rifle I want to take a look at today is kind of interesting and kind of unusual. And you're probably looking at it and saying, wait a minute, that's a Mosin Nagant 9130. There's nothing particularly interesting about that. We've got a empty magazine, as you can see, and nothing in the pipe. I did clear the rifle prior to the video, but it's always nice to show everyone that it's empty. And you would be correct. It is a 9130, and there isn't anything particularly unusual about a 9130. They were imported in vast numbers over the last couple of decades. The unusual thing about this rifle is the condition that it's in. It's a fairly early 9130. Most of the rifles you see in this country are wartime production, made in the 1940s. This one was made in 1936. By far the most common are made at Ijevsk. This one was made at Tula. Some people place a bit of a premium on Tula-made rifles. I don't know that there's any real quantifiable difference between Tula and Ijevsk as far as quality. This one has a hex receiver. That's a little bit unusual as well, but there's still plenty of hex receiver 9130s in this country. What makes this rifle fairly unusual is that it wasn't imported in the last couple of decades. And it really, from the time it was manufactured and shipped out from the arsenal, it's never been in Soviet inventory. This is a rifle that was shipped to Spain. I'm pretty sure it was shipped to Spain and used during the Spanish Civil War. It was captured by Franco's forces and put in a Spanish warehouse until the 1950s. When they were imported, they were sold and imported into the United States. And I bought this one about 20 years ago over at Sarco when they were still in Sterling, New Jersey, in that dimly lit showroom attached to a huge warehouse full of really cool stuff. That was back in the days when there was still cool stuff in New Jersey. But Sarco was really, really cool back then. It's still pretty cool. It's now located up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. It's also, or Easton, I think it's Easton, Pennsylvania. They're still very cool, but it was much cooler when it was still in New Jersey, in that old warehouse with that sort of dark and dingy showroom. I really loved going there. But anyway, this rifle came off of a rack of very similar 9130s, and all of those rifles had the defining characteristics of Spanish Civil War veteran rifles. Some had had the front sight replaced. This one has not. It still has its original front sight. Some of them had the wire sling swivels. This one does not. Some of them had markings on the stock that indicated that they'd been through the Spanish ordnance system. This one does not have any of those markings. And the exporter back in the 1950s in Spain marked a lot of the receivers made in USSR or there was a typographically erroneous marking that also said made in URRS, which is kind of cool, but this rifle doesn't have that either. So basically, although it was located on a rack with a bunch of Spanish Civil War guns, all of the evidence to support the fact that this is a Spanish Civil War gun is strictly circumstantial. There are no absolutely qualifying features to this gun. But it's important to note that there are none of the absolutely disqualifying features. It is from the same time period, and it clearly has never been Arsenal refinished or had any of the updates that were made to the rear sight base, for instance, that the Soviets would have done had it remained in Soviet inventory. So it's a pretty cool rifle. The only thing that's kind of sucky about it is the fact that the bolt is mismatched. But that seems to be another defining characteristic of Spanish Civil War veteran Mosin Nagants that you'll see in this country. They almost all have mismatched bolts. I don't know if that was done when the rifles were captured, if they threw all the rifles in one pile and all the bolts in the other pile, and then they kind of reassembled them later in a sort of haphazard, willy-nilly fashion, or whether it was done by the exporter, whether it was done by the importer, whether it happened in the field, I don't know. But I certainly would not have selected this rifle if any of the other rifles in the warehouse had matching bolts. So I'm pretty sure of that. I'm not sure why I selected this one. Again, it was about 20 years ago. I think it might have been the fact that it was Tula. It might have been the fact that it had a hex receiver. It might have been the overall condition. Although the bolt is mismatched, the floor plate is matching. The butt plate is matching. It head spaces correctly, so it's not a problem to shoot it. And I don't really have a problem with the mismatched bolt. But anyway, this is about as close to what a 9130 would have looked like if you had been in Stalingrad and grabbed a rifle out of the hands of a Soviet soldier to see what they had before all the arsenal refinishing and everything else happened to the rifles. And it's actually amazing to see the quality that the Soviets were capable of imparting to one of these rifles. You know, in a time like 1936, they weren't under a lot of economic pressure. They weren't under a lot of military pressure. They had pretty much unlimited resources and money. And it's amazing how nice this rifle really is. A lot of people will tell you that the only good Mosin Nagants are Imperial manufactured receivers, based on Imperial manufactured receivers. The Finns apparently exclusively used Imperial manufactured receivers and barrels when they reused barrels. But this rifle is really a great example, or a great illustration of the fact that the Soviets could build a really beautiful rifle when they had the luxury to do so. So let's move over to the bench top. We'll take a closer look at this rifle, and I think you may end up being surprised and impressed with its condition. All right, guys, so here is our 1936 Tula Mosin Nagant 9130 in all of its unrefinished, unrestored, original condition. Obviously, it is a very, 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 very long rifle, even though this is actually a short rifle version of the original M91. It's still quite long, and there was really no way that I was going to fit the entire thing in the frame. So because this type of benchtop review is a completely new concept and a completely new format for the channel, I figured maybe the best way to go about this would be in a systematic manner. We'll start at the receiver and magazine and bolt. We'll move our way towards the rear, towards the butt, take a look at a few salient features there, and then work our way out towards the muzzle. This is not meant in any way to be a really in-depth review, but I want to take a fairly close look at most of the parts, give you a good look at this rifle, and just get an impression of what a 9130 looks like if it's never been through the Arsenal refinish process. So first of all, let's make sure that it's unloaded. I've already done this, but makes people feel better. The chamber is empty. You can see the magazine is also empty. The gun is clear and safe. So first of all, let's take a look at the receiver. It is a hex receiver. The rifle was made in 1936. I've already said that. You can see it has the Tula maker's mark on there with the date and then number in Latin letters for some reason, and the actual serial number. You can see immediately from looking at this that, first of all of the wonderful machining on this rifle hasn't been rounded off and buffed up and sanded down as it would have been in the Arsenal refinish process. But you can also immediately see that in 1936, without a lot of political and military and economic pressure, the Russians, the Soviets actually, were able to produce a pretty nice rifle. If you look at the machining on these flats and these scallops, it's all perfectly done. There are not any of the really apparent ugly tool marks that we expect when we think about looking at a Mosin Nagant. The bolt actually operates, I know I just had this open, but the bolt actually operates very smoothly. There's no hitching or catching. The bolt throw is very, very smooth. You can see the trigger is not blued. On most Arsenal refinished rifles, the trigger was blued after the fact, but they left the factory in the white, or at least they were doing so in 1936. And it's actually shaped like a trigger. It's not shaped like the actuating device on a staple gun. The serial number here, well, it's upside down from the way I'm holding the rifle, but it does match the serial number on the receiver. And of course, you'll notice the serial number on the bolt is mismatched. And why don't we just go ahead and take the bolt out of the receiver. Oops. And the bolt is in very, very nice condition. I'm going to detail strip that and so we can take a look at the individual parts, and I will be back with you in just a moment. So now we've got the bolt stripped down to its parts, and I wanted to show you that it's also in its original condition. You'll notice none of the very nice machining on this has been rounded off or buffed off or sanded off as it would have been in the refinishing process. And although our number does not match the serial number on the gun, I want to show that the rifle, that the bolt is in fact appropriate to the rifle, and all the parts within the bolt match the bolt and are also appropriate for the rifle. So you can see here, there's a star-shaped maker's mark. That's the Tula parts marking, star-shaped, and it's in unrefinished condition. The bolt head also has the Tula star parts mark on there, as well as the extractor, which also has the Tula star parts mark. The cocking piece likewise has the Tula star parts mark, as well as a few other markings on the back here. Again, you can see the machining on this is just about perfect. I mean, it's amazing how nice Soviet guns can be, despite their reputation for the contrary. The connector does not have a Tula star parts mark, but it does have a small T right here, and it has an inspection mark which matches the inspection mark found on this side of the bolt shank and also on the back of the cocking piece. It's impressed there. So there's no reason to believe that this bolt isn't all complete as it was made at the factory. The firing pin also has the Tula star parts mark. It's kind of worn off from friction against this spring, but so the bolt is all complete and it is appropriate for the rifle. So that's kind of cool. And as I said earlier, it does head space correctly. So I'm not really all that concerned about it having a mismatched bolt. And again, one of the defining characteristics of most of these Spanish Civil War veteran rifles is that they've got mismatched bolts. So anyway, let me put this back together and we will move on. Okay, so we got our bolt back together. Let's just set that off to the side for the moment. I want to show you the inside of the receiver. And you can see here, this was left in the white. It's not blued. And of course, all that is blued when these rifles go through or went through the Arsenal refinishing process. So it's kind of interesting to see that some of those things were left in the raw. Doesn't look like this has ever had any finish on it at all. Of course, it's got some rust on it nowadays, but the magazine housing is pretty standard. There's nothing mechanically different about the magazine than in later rifles. The magazine follower and spring assembly is pretty nicely machined. It's probably the roughest thing on the gun. I don't see too many. Yes, there's a Tula star right there. There's a couple of other small inspection marks, it looks like. Pretty standard. So on the barrel shank here, just ahead of the receiver, in addition to the Arsenal mark and the date and the serial number, there's the normal myriad of various inspection marks. I've got to refresh my white grease pencil here at some point in time. So before we get any further forward and before I forget, let's move towards the butt and take a look at a couple of things. This does have the early style of sling escutcheons, which are very nicely inletted into the stock and screwed in place. You can see here a 1936 Tula mark on the stock. That would certainly have been obliterated during the Arsenal refinish process if this rifle had stayed in the Soviet inventory. And there's another mark there which is hard to make out. But all of these early markings, there's a numeral 2 there, all of these early markings on these stocks would have been more or less wiped out during the Arsenal refinishing process. This is something else which is, I don't know exactly what this is. I don't know if this is a JSD or something carved in there. This is another very typical thing to find on Spanish Civil War veteran rifles. It seems like the individual soldiers were allowed to sort of personalize their rifles a bit. I don't know, maybe they weren't allowed to do it, but it does seem to be very common. I remember quite a few of the rifles I saw at Sarco had stuff carved in the buttstock. Some of it was a bit more legible and elaborate than this. The serial number for the rifle does appear on the buttstock. The buttstock is, well, it's a buttstock. It's pretty well beat up. But there's no cracks. The toe's not chipped out at all. Overall, the stock, despite being kind of normally beat up, it's actually in pretty good condition. So moving on to the rear sight, during the Arsenal refinish process, all early rifles which didn't have the pins installed in the sight base to hold the base onto the barrel, these early ones were just held in place with a single screw, tiny screw, which you can see there. I think they're dovetailed on and then screwed in place. Later sight bases were pinned in place on the barrel. And every one of these early rifles that received Arsenal refinishing from the Soviet Arsenal system, the Soviet ordnance system, had those pins installed. And this one, they are obviously not there because this rifle was not Arsenal refinished. So that's kind of cool. The rear sight leaf is pretty much standard. It's in its original configuration, just like everything else. It does have some bluing left intact. There's very little original bluing left on the receiver or on the magazine housing. The handguards have brass caps in the rear as well as in the front. Let me turn this around. The rear handguard band has a Tula star parts marking on it, as well as the band retainer. There's also a Tula star parts mark on the rear sight base. As we move farther forward, again, we've got these inlet escutcheons again, they're very nicely inletted into the wood and held in place with screws. Most of these screws are fairly well indexed as well. I don't know if that's intentional or if it just happened to come out that way. The front band again has the Tula star parts mark, as does the retainer. The front cap on the handguard is also brass, although the nose cap on the nose of the stock is steel, and that's held in place with a screw. I don't know if that has any... I don't believe that has any parts markings on it. Perhaps they're inside. You probably have noticed the cleaning rod is missing. That is another thing which is very typical of these Spanish Civil War guns. A lot of them are missing their cleaning rods. Some are fitted with kind of aftermarket cleaning rods in Spain of Spanish manufacture. I can't imagine what happened to this cleaning rod. I mean, maybe it was used as a skewer to roast shish kebabs over the campfire or something, because it sure as hell was never used to clean the inside of this barrel. The barrel's okay. There's still plenty of rifling in there. And actually, when I slugged it, it slugs pretty tight. So it should be a fairly good shooter. I don't think I've ever actually fired this rifle. But it is dark, dark, dark. It's gotten very rotten inside. So I've thought about replacing the cleaning rod. 9130 cleaning rods are not hard to come by, but I haven't found an early one, and I haven't found one that's not, in Arsenal refinish condition with really that dark black bluing on it. And so if I can locate a cleaning rod that's the right condition for the rifle, I may buy one and install it. On the other hand, sometimes I think it's better to leave an artifact like this in the condition it was found in. The front sight, well, I don't know about the base. I guess the base is integral with the barrel, but the front sight, the actual front sight hood has the Tula parts mark star on there as well. So that's pretty much the rifle, stem to stern. I don't know if there's anything else we can really take a look at in too much detail. I just wanted to give you guys a close look at an unrefinished, completely original 9130 as it would have left the factory in 1936. So please let me know in the comments if you found this helpful or enjoyable, and if you'd like me to do any more of these. I'm actually going to do another one right now, but I don't know. We'll see what the feedback's like before I plan any more for the future. Let's go wrap this up. So if you can get your hands on one of these Spanish Civil War veteran M9130s, it's definitely a worthwhile thing to buy. They're not very common. They're very interesting. It's a really interesting variant of the rifle. But if you can call it a variant, it doesn't vary at all from the original design, and they're the most unmessed with rifles you can generally find on the market today. But they're definitely a worthwhile thing to get your hands on if you can do so at a reasonable cost. I don't have a problem with Arsenal refinished rifles. I've owned many of them myself, and they serve the collecting community very well. And the Arsenal refinishing process itself is part of the military history of those rifles. But I think it's very neat to be able to find a rifle that's in its original condition, albeit, fairly heavily used. But it gives you an idea of what one of these rifles would have looked like in the hands of a Soviet soldier or a communist revolutionary in Spain, for that matter, at the time that these were in active service. So I hope somebody has found this video enlightening, and I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel. It goes a long way to help keep me here on the tube. If you're already a subscriber, click the little bell icon down below. That'll allow YouTube to send you notifications when I post new content to the channel. Like, share, tell your friends, and when I come back here with a new video, I hope to see each of you here then. Later, guys.